Recording. Okay, I'll crack on because time's pressing, and obviously we've all got places to go, particularly on a sunny day. In a minute, I'm going to hand over to Rachel and Sanch, who are going to give us an intro into supply chain. Used to say logs, but it's not logs anymore; it's supply chain. So I'll get my terminology right. But before I do that, I'm just going to go through a couple of 3 parish notices for our PDTers. Firstly, thank you all for attending on this 3rd and final webinar. Less than 4 weeks to go to D-Day, and we've already booked the weather looking good. So well done to all those that have completed the modules so far. Still a little to do. On the ones you still got to do, security, just to inform for FYI, Security Risk Essentials is an external site. So unlike the other sites that we get the Survey Monkey and we can see whether you've done them or not, you need to screenshot the final certificate. So when you get the final certificate and send it to us. So when you finish, you've ploughed your way through it, there'll be a question at the end, or questions at the end. It'll say, well done, you've successfully passed. Just screenshot and send that to us as sort of proof that you've done it. Pre-travel questionnaire, if you could fill that out, because that tells me how and gives me faith that you can actually get to BF. Some of you, for example, might be traveling down. I don't know how you're getting down when you're in the rest of you. I will be doing a pickup from Penryn train station on Friday evening. At some time, I'll look sort of what time you're all coming in and try and coincide it with the train. Accommodation will be booked for you on the Friday night, and for those traveling for the following Friday as well. So the course starts at 0800 on Saturday, but for those traveling down, the accommodation will be booked on Friday night. The course will finish about 5-6 p.m. the following Friday, the 8th. But for those that want it, accommodation in BF will be booked on that Friday night, and we will drop you back to the train station on first thing Saturday morning. But if you could fill out that pre-travel question, it gives me a sort of feel for how you're all getting down here and what issues you have. And the final thing before I shut up and get over to logs, sorry, supply chain, is start looking at your packing list. Read through your join instructions. There's lots of stuff in there. I'm sure I'm teaching you all to suck eggs, but if you can read through the packing list, make sure you've got anything. Please communicate with me. Let me know if there's anything you're short of. Wouldn't want you going out buying hundreds of pieces of gear because I might have them, or any help you need in anything. Just drop us an email on the chat or via Teams, whatever, and we'll be there to help. 2 minutes. Any questions from me on that? Okay, I'll shut up and hand it over to Rachel and Sanch.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, Yorick. And hi, everybody. I think I've met most of you before, but maybe just for the purposes of the recording, and for anyone that doesn't know me, I'm Rachel, the Programme Supply Chain Manager, and this is Sancha, our Emergency Supply Chain Specialist. Oh, hi, Sophia, that you're able to join. So I just mentioned we do only have an hour to talk over the sort of key fundamental areas of supply chain in an emergency response. So for that reason, we've had to be a bit selective about which areas of supply chain to focus on throughout the webinar. And in all honesty, we'll probably only just scratch the surface today, but that's fine. And important to mention that the supply chain elements of an emergency response will always be led by a deployed supply chain staff member. And so anything that we talk about in today's webinar is really just with a view of giving you an awareness. So if you're deploying with a supply chain person, you know what they'll be working on and where the areas of crossover are with your work. I should also mention briefly that we are in the process of updating all of our supply chain guidance documents, templates, tools, the lot. So everything we talk about today, there will be more formal written guidance coming in the not too distant future. I will try and pause as we go, just to allow time for questions and things. And please just feel free to sort of pop a hand up as we go, or in fact, just shout out, because I might not be able to see a hand. So if you have any questions, feel free to just shout out. So yeah, next slide when you're ready, please, Yorick.
Yeah. There you go.
It's just loading. There we go. So on the screen, you will see our supply chain team structure, or at least as it will be as of next month when Benny comes on board and joins us. Just a couple things to mention on this and how it links to our work when we deploy. So it's definitely fair to say that the whole organisation has gone through a really big period of change, and it's been the same for supply chain. And I just want to mention before we get going that the work that supply chain do today, both when deployed and at HQ, is now very different into the ways in which we used to work. A couple of things within that to pinpoint in particular. So supply chain have now taken over responsibility for all procurement activity for programs and emergencies. And that's a key thing to mention, because when deployed, your supply chain specialist is now responsible for all procurement activity, whereas previously they would have only been responsible for shipping stock. Another key change is that a few years ago, it would have been much more common for an SRT volunteer to deploy and lead on logistics elements of an emergency. And back then it was much more feasible for that to happen because at that point we only had one method of supplying aid, through international import. But fast forward to today, we're seeing an awful lot more of everything, really. We're doing more and doing it bigger. So we've seen a really steep increase in partner procurement. All types of procurement, not just partner procurement, across the board. And the more that the organisation is spending, the more that there's an increased risk. So from that, you can see why there has been a need for more supply chain specialists to be trained and deployable to carry out those procurements. Yeah, next slide when you're ready, please, Yorick. Perfect. So this slide is really just a bit of a summary, because we are going to go through these in more detail throughout the webinar, but this is just to give you a bit of an intro and a flavour on what some of the activities your supply chain specialist will be working on when on a deployment. Every situation is slightly different, but generally speaking, we'll be overseeing every type of procurement in the field. So for example, if you need a driver, and we would be involved at that point. We'll be scoping partners and consignees. We'll be working on stock sourcing and allocation. That's quite a big chunk of our work area. If we're importing any aid items, which is more common in an emergency, we'll be scoping out the customs and importation process right through to the last mile logistics, and scoping warehousing and trucking and that kind of thing. And then all of those that information that we have gathered will then be recorded in a supply chain or procurement plan. That's quite a key document for us, and Sanch is going to go over in a little bit more detail later on. Next slide, please, Yorick. So this is just a little bit of a discussion point. I know we don't have as many people on the call as we thought, but we were just trying to make things a little bit more interactive. And I just wondered what, it sounds like a really sort of obvious question in some ways, but what are the thoughts amongst the group on when a supply chain person should deploy during a major disaster? At what point, if you had to sort of hazard a guess, would we say?
At the start?
Thank you, Sophia. Yes, definitely at the start. Any sort of thoughts on why it's important to have us involved right from the start?
To start finding out what the situation is in terms of ports, supply, the market, warehousing.
Exactly that, yeah. So I think important that our objectives are achieved in conjunction with the emergency team, just so that we're not sort of playing catch up, I suppose. And exactly that, it takes time to sort of set up the entire supply chain and feel assured enough to ship thousands of pounds worth of stock potentially to an unknown partner. So yes, we definitely want to deploy as early as we possibly can. Yeah, next slide, please, Yorick. Okay, thank you. So next question for the group. I mentioned this briefly earlier, but it's a bit of a hot topic at the moment in deployments, and quite an important topic. I just wondered in this scenario, if you guys are deployed with a supply chain specialist and you're sort of needing a car or a translator or any kind of service, what are the thoughts on why you think a supply chain specialist might need to be involved in that situation? It's not a trick question, I promise.
Is that to get the value for money, like, you know, understanding the sort of the costs that are involved in hiring a driver and finding the most suitable and the one that's also cost effective for the organization?
Yeah, very much so. That's definitely one reason, which actually leads nicely into the next slide when you're ready, Yorick. Yes, so exactly as was said, so at any time that shelter box funds are being spent, we must all follow the shelter box procurement policy. And supply chain are responsible for overseeing all programmes and emergency spend over £1,000. So that includes things like drivers, translators, enumerators, meal consultants, any kind of spend. So I think the key message in this is that anytime that there is a spend in the field, please do reach out to your supply chain focal point. They know the procurement policy inside and out. They really think of us as the gatekeepers to making sure that that procurement policy is followed. You know, we're working with suppliers every day. It's sort of what we do, it's what we're trained to do. We're trained to sort of seek the right number of quotes. We're trained to how to request quotes, ensuring that suppliers are treated in the same way. We know sort of how to negotiate on payment terms, how to actually set up the supplier for payment physically on our systems, how to create the right contracts, making sure there's an audit trail for that procurement. So all of those things that we do is really designed to protect the organisation, essentially. Any questions on that one before we move on? Brilliant. Okay, so let's just move on to the different types of assistance and how supply chain deliver these, and then within that, some of the sort of key roles within a deployment. The session is mostly focusing on the gift in kind modality because that's most common for shelter box in an emergency response, but important to note that a big proportion of our supply chain work does now focus on local procurement through our partners. So I do have a couple of slides to go through on that type of assistance. As far as CVA cash and voucher assistance goes, we know that this will become a more frequent type of assistance that Shelterbox will be delivering. Our team, supply chain, is currently in the process of upskilling ourselves on how to really add value and support that type of assistance. So we're not there just yet, so we're not going to touch on this topic today. But the key takeaway is that the market assessment is what really helps to determine what type of assistance is more appropriate. And that's something that supply chain can either gather through our partners when deployed, and sort of have those conversations if that data's already been done. It's not as common for us to do it directly, but there are cases where that's been done in the past. Next slide, please, Yorick. So just going into talking a little bit about the international gift in kind shipping option. So this is most common method of supplying aid to an emergency. And the map shows our global pre-positioning warehouses where our current suppliers and also where our current suppliers manufacture. So you'll see the yellow boxes is where we pre-position stock ready to be dispatched in places like Dubai, Belgium, Panama, and also SBOP. Blue boxes are used a lot less frequently, or we've only got very low volumes of stock there right now, but may utilise those in the future. And then the red boxes is where our suppliers manufacture. Just in terms of, from the purposes of trying to make this a little bit more engaging where we can, there's another question for the group. What are some of the thoughts on why we think this sort of method of sourcing aid is more common in a disaster? Like, what are some of the reasons why we might ship stock from pre-positioning? Again, it's not a trick question.
Speed of response.
Yes. Yeah, very much so. Thank you, Michael.
And potentially trying to get the pre-positioning close enough so that you can minimize the use of air freight where possible. But obviously in an emergency, sometimes you have no choice.
Yeah, very much so. And also sort of quality is quite a big one here as well. We know that the quality of our global aid items have been procured to really high standards. So, you know, they're items that are known to us. We've got the contracts in place. We have data on them. It's sort of a known entity. I guess there's lots of you know, pros and cons to each method, right? But it's just a couple of examples there. So yes, stock sourcing is a big part of supply chain specialist role when deployed. So they will be looking at all of these global stock levels in those locations. They'll be using our inventory tracking tool, working out if there are any stock gaps or shortages anywhere. If there are, they'll be speaking with our suppliers about how to close those gaps. And then at the same time, they'll be comparing transit times and freight costs with our freight forwarders to work out which is the most suitable location to pull stock from. Next slide, please, Yorick. Brilliant. So another relatively hot topic at the moment. The next 3 slides are on partner procurement. We're just going to talk a little bit about exactly what we mean by partner procurement, some of the advantages and disadvantages, and then we'll talk over some of the steps that supply chain carry out when working on a local procurement. I probably should say this method of supplying aid is becoming much more common, especially in our longer term programs, less so in an emergency, but it has happened in the past. So firstly, just a sort of quick definition on what we actually mean by partner procurement, and we define this as the provision of a grant payment to a vetted partner to allow them to carry out the procurement of goods, works, or services. So you can see from that statement, we're essentially outsourcing our procurement to our partner. And there are lots of reasons why we would do that. One being that we don't tend to be registered in the places that we work, and therefore don't have that permanent presence that's needed to sort of set up those supplier relationships and maintain these. And there are also like tax and duties implications. So it's more beneficial and more cost effective usually for us to do it through our partner, at least for right now. So again, I think we all know there's lots of advantages to partner procurement, which is why it's in our organisational strategy. We know it boosts local economies and has the advantage of providing, in some cases, more culturally appropriate aid items. We know that it can be more environmentally friendly, providing they're actually true local items. And it does also reduce the sort of burden or the bottleneck on our global infrastructure supply, as well as increasing our knowledge of local markets. I think it's fair to say, as with anything, it does come with some challenges or some risks. which is on the next slide. Thanks, right. So it's fair to say that this method of getting hold of aid items through our partners locally does come with substantial risk increases for Shelter Box, really because we've got less visibility and control over the entire process. So we're essentially putting our faith in our partners to spend Shelter Box funds in an appropriate way. Which does come with a few sort of specific risks. We know that there's an increased risk of fraud or corruption by doing it this way. Quite often in the places that we work, it's sort of almost common practice to sort of accept bribes and those kind of things, whereas obviously for us, it's not something that we're sort of willing to accept in our supply chain. I think there are sort of ethical procurement concerns. So, for example, like where do suppliers contract, sort of who do suppliers contract to work in their factories? You know, what are the working conditions like? Are we inadvertently funding child labour, for instance? And we know there's also the probability of providing lower quality items when compared to the global stock. So for all of those reasons, we have to carry out enhanced partner due diligence just to vet their policies and procedures, which is on the next slide. Oh, I think we might have come slightly out of order. Try the next one. Here we go.
Yeah.
Thank you. So I'm just going to briefly talk you through some of the steps that a supply chain specialist will be working through if they're deployed to an emergency and doing this in person, but the same steps also apply if they're doing this from the office working on a programme. I've narrowed it down for the purposes of this chat, but it's fair to say that partner procurement is really in-depth and it does take a lot of work to set up. First thing just to mention is there can be a little bit of a misconception that supply chain don't need to be involved, and there's a feeling that the partner should be doing everything. But from our perspective, that really isn't the case. We're responsible for making sure the partner spends funds in a fair and transparent way and that they followed their own procurement procedures. So for that reason, we need to be involved from the early project design phase. And we'll be doing a multitude of things really simultaneously. But some of the key things we'll be running through is working to understand the local context, local market strength, to make sure that type of procurement is suitable. We'll also be assessing the partners' procurement and warehouse manuals to identify any strengths and weaknesses. We will be involved in aid item package selection. And what I mean by that is we'll be going through what is the need. From there, we'll be comparing it to cluster specifications. We'll be comparing it to our own global specifications, and we'll compare costs, lead times, and also where the items actually come from, if they're being true local items or if they're being imported anyway. And from there, that helps us to make a decision on which items should be imported and which ones could be locally sourced. We then agree with the partner on exactly how they'll carry out the procurement, which is mainly driven by their procurement policy. But if it's not quite strong enough, we might specify that they have to do it in a slightly sort of stricter manner. You know, if they're suggesting a 3-quote process, we might say, no, you must go to tender for this level of spend. And then all of that is recorded within a procurement plan, which the supply chain specialist is responsible for pulling together. Just one thing to mention on after the project has ended, we do then have to do a bit of an audit process, just where we receive a set of pre-agreed documents from the partner that we used in the buying process. And then we go through those with a fine tooth comb, really, and just make sure that what they said they were going to do is exactly the process that has been followed. I'm going to pause there for a moment. Any questions before we carry on?
Rach, is there ever ability to partner with your IPD program management colleagues to do any post procurement checks on the ground? Because you know, a lot of the checks you have to do are remote, based on paper and digital records. Do you ever get the opportunity to get some real life check-in and confirmation at the end of a project?
Yeah, I think it's that's a really good point, and it's something that we need to be building in much more frequently when we're sort of planning these types of procurements. And I think you're right, even if a supply chain specialist isn't able to deploy for any reason, I think that's an area that IPD colleagues can support with getting sort of physical eyes on that stock. I think it's something they're hoping to achieve in the upcoming Ukraine deployment. So if we time it right, when stock's actually in the warehouse, then that's a really good opportunity to sort of actually check those items in person, do a proper quality check or a spot check or whatever that might look like. So yes, it's a good point. I think it's something we need to try to build in and put systems and processes around a little bit, make that a little bit of a tighter process. And it's a good way of, it's a good risk mitigation, right? So it's something we should be doing.
Yeah, and obviously Obi went on this PDT training in March, and I'm coming this time. So there is the intention for us to try and help and provide additional support and expertise into yourselves and IPD to help with some of that post check-in.
Yeah, brilliant. No, I do like that idea, and I think it's important that we sort of strengthen that link between finance and supply chain where we can.
Rachel, just a quick question from me on really time frames for an enhanced due diligence. And does that link in with an emergency response, or are we really looking more at the partner-led, more program responses? Because
yeah, the process is definitely much more developed for a program. There have been cases where normally on an emergency project, or at least the ones that I've personally worked on, the partner procurement element of the project has been a much lower spend because the bulk of it has been an international import. So where the spend is lower, we might not go into quite as much detail, or the things that or I guess it's like a sped up process, right? And this is also quite a new process for us as well. So I mentioned we were developing systems, tools and processes and what have you. I think within that we're trying to build in minimum requirements for an emergency in the same way that we're doing with the sort of program cycle management work. So I think it's something that needs a little bit more thought. There'd definitely be a level of checks on a partner in an emergency. It's just sort of how we streamline that and what are the absolute minimum requirements for the level of spend.
Okay, thank you.
Brilliant. Okay, so I think it's the last slide with me, and then I'll hand over to Sancha. So we're just going to talk about partner scoping and selection. This one is like a fundamental part of every deployment, emergency or other. I suppose like the partner that we're working with is sort of the foundations to a response, and we're essentially trying to choose a partner who's the best sort of fit for the response, but which also aligns with our wider strategic objectives around partnering and capacity building and that kind of thing. So this isn't an area that sits solely with supply chain. It cuts across every department and links in very heavily to the organisational capacity assessment and the due diligence process. I know that there's a piece of work coming up on sort of how we carry out those due diligence checks on our partners. So I'll be thinking about how all of our partner scoping fits in to that wider piece of work. But for now, we're just going to think about, we're just going to chat about some of the sort of supply chain considerations when we're scoping a new partner. It's one of the main sort of objectives of a trip, and we'd be having conversations with partners live in an emergency. I'm just wondering if anyone has any thoughts on what sort of are some of the supply chain considerations when choosing a supplier. Maybe just keeping in mind that we could be sort of shipping and purchasing quite high volumes of stock through that partner. Yeah, just any thoughts on some of the top line things we might want to consider with a partner.
Start off, Rachel, with just reliability and track record, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good one.
I expect you'd want to look at things like their safeguarding policy and processes and reporting mechanisms as well.
Yeah, definitely. I'd say that sort of falls into the wider sort of IPD topics, but definitely something that falls under the OCA sort of assessment tool. I think that links into the next slide when you're ready, please, Yorick.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there's definitely lots of things that the whole organisation consider when choosing a partner, but I've just picked out some of the more supply chain specific ones. And I think knowing if the partner is sort of local or international is like key for every department, really, because it sort of tells us a little bit more about how the partner is structured, the size of their organisation, and tells us a little bit about how much support they might need from us throughout a response. And then more specifically, we'd sort of always dig into what's the size and the structure of their supply chain team, what projects are they working on. We're just sort of lightly trying to figure out how much capacity they would have to take on a shelter box project, and how much, what's their ability to handle large volumes of stock with their current projects and workloads. We would also want to know if they're experienced in international import, especially for emergencies. So we want to know if they can act as our consignee or receiver of items. If it's something they've not done before, it doesn't necessarily mean that we can't work with them. It might just mean that we need to provide a little bit more support on scoping things like customs and import procedures. But I think at the very least, we'd want to know that they were a registered entity and that they have access to tax exemption, which is a big part of our work when we deploy. We'd want to know sort of how strong their procurement and stock management policies are, which is especially relevant if we're procuring items through a partner. We'd want to know if they sort of have strong relationships with local suppliers for sort of tracking or any stock purchases, and if they've got framework agreements in place. And then, of course, do they have warehousing and tracking capacity is one of the big things that we would dig through with a partner when deployed. And actually sort of in lots of cases go and sort of see their warehousing in person and carry out an assessment, which Sancha's going to come on to. So I guess just the final point to mention on this, we're in going through that process in sort of assessing a partner's capacity, we're really identifying areas of strength and weakness, which will then form the basis for agreeing division of responsibilities in a project agreement or an MOU between ourselves and our partner. I think that's it from me. I'm going to hand over to Sancha. Oh, you're muted.
Great start.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. So I'm just going to take you through the last few slides. So the one that I want to take you through is the first one is the supply chain plan. So the supply chain plan is basically a document that we fill out for all of the responses and programs that we're working on. And what it really is, it's a comprehensive sort of chronological overview of all of the supply chain information and it involves information on customs and importation processes. It records the consignee details. It records all of the aid items that we're sort of shipping. And it's a detailed view of all of the in-country logistics, and that's warehousing and trucking. So if you just want to click on that link, Yorick, it opens just a template just to give you a flavour.
Try.
If not, it's fine.
Oh.
It's a blank document with different segments, but like I've said, it's got a consignee segment.
Unfortunately, I've been stuck. I can't get into it because it doesn't give me access.
No problem.
SharePointed.
Okay, no problem. Maybe I'll get one up in a bit, but if anybody would like to see a copy of the document, then I can definitely share it after this, or Yorick, I can share it with you if then you want to send it out. But it's a really long, comprehensive document that like I said, we'll work with our partners and the emergencies or programs team to obtain all of that information. We have one for emergencies and one for responses. And like I said, it is all around in-country customs importation processes, and it's a live document that we will continue to work on, and we will continue to input information as we go through the design and the delivery of that response with the emergency or the program team. And basically with the supply chain as well, just to note that it's developed in conjunction with a project agreement, and it's required to be signed off before any sort of stock is shipped. But just to note, there are obviously exceptions to the rules. So if there is a major disaster, we have been known to send items and send stock before MOU signatures or before supply chain plans have been finalised. But this is via a waiver process that we go into. So next slide, please. So this is international sort of transport. So in conjunction with the response activity, supply chain will also be simultaneously working with suppliers to order the items that are required. And a crucial part of ordering the items is how are we going to get it from point of source, which is either suppliers or prepositions, to actual place of events. So we'll look at all different options, and we'll be scoping, utilising a multitude of different sources of information on the best routes to get the items to where they need to be. And we do this again by speaking to freight forwarders, partners in country. We'll link in with the logistics cluster. We'll utilise our own contacts as well and just triangulate that information. So there's the 3 noted on there. So from air, you've got the gift in kind, the commercial option, and then the charter flight. So just briefly, so air is usually utilised in an emergency to get aid in, but it can come with its own disadvantages, as you can get quite a bit of a bottleneck if you are responding to the larger disasters. For the gift in kind flight opportunities, they're actually quite common in disasters, and there are 3 flights that are shared from our global pre-positioned hubs that have obvious benefits from a financial perspective. There is no cost attached to the actual flight itself, but the disadvantages are that you have no control over the cargo. So you will be put on flights when there is space, but you could get bumped if there isn't enough space. You could literally just find out that morning. I know with the recent Pakistan response, then there were issues about utilising that gift in kind flight, as you can have cargo that's split over different flights, so you don't retain that control over the actual scheduling, which can cause quite a lot of issues. For the commercial flight option, these are less common, and space is an issue with these as well, and flights are quite infrequent, but it is definitely an option that we would explore. And then if commercial flights are not an option for us and we can't access any gift in kind flights, then another air option for us is the chartering of a flight, but that's a huge expense. The next one is C. Again, this is an option that we would scope out, and depending on the urgency of us getting aid into country, C is a great option for us, but it can be the slower of the options. And then the road option is, again, we would scope this out. We'd have a look again at all options, but the consideration with this is we would need to look at transit time. So what's the transit time that we would need to factor into the response? We'd have to look at road infrastructure, what the damage has been done to that, what borders you'll be crossing, is there any border issues, is there any bottlenecks at borders as well? So they're all the things that we look at and take into consideration. Any questions on that before I move on to the next slide? No? Thank you. So this is, I know Rachel touched upon it before, which is a really sort of crucial key scoping part for us, which is around the tax exemption and the customs. So a key point at any response, as mentioned before, and it's scoped out immediately, is can we actually obtain tax exemption? As the lack of tax exemption is an extremely large financial cost that would need to be considered. So to gain a tax exemption, we'd need a consignee, and again, Rachel did touch on it before, but it's due to us not having a permanent presence in most of the places we work. So we're not legally registered there. We can't accept the cargo. And because we can't accept it, we need to address it or consign it to an organisation who's registered and has permanent presence in country. So alongside the tax exemption scoping that we'll be doing sort of with our partners and with the emergency or programme team, is we'll also be looking at the customs as well. And the customs and importation process can be extremely complicated at times, especially on the onset of a larger disaster. There's a huge amount of information that is out there. So the sources of information that's down on the slide, but one that I just want to call out is the impact working group. So this working group is actually activated in an emergency, and it's open to any organisation, international organisation, INGOs, UN agency, private sector as well can also access this. And it's really a platform to share challenges, to identify solutions. And it's been really key. I know that I used it when we deployed to Turkey. Because as I said, there's a huge amount of information, a lot of it's conflicting. There's a lot of issues and sometimes incorrect information that's being bandied around. So that's the one place that you can go to really try and source that real-time information. And again, because it changes so much as well. And then the other ones are obviously sources of information where we would triangulate as much as possible. Next one, unless there's any questions on that. Thank you. So now moving on to in-country warehousing and inventory management. So again, just a sort of question out to you and just to have a think around. So if our partner's responsible in a response for providing in-country warehousing, then what do you think the reasons are that supply chain would need to be involved with the actual warehouse assessments and inventory management? I can open it out to the group if you've got any ideas.
I think you'd want to reassure yourself that it is a secure and safe location and suitable from a physical perspective. Yeah, really good. That's key with it. We're sending in high value stock, from a financial value. So we need to ensure that we've got accountability from a supply chain perspective, and is it safe and is it secure, that location?
Just one on that, Sanch. Does that have to be a supply chain person, or can one of the team, one of the other non-supply chain team, do that warehouse assessment?
So we've actually had this discussion recently. So there are warehousing checklists that we have that we've got information for. So if the supply chain is deployed, then it would usually be the supply chain who would be doing that type of warehouse check-in, etc. If there isn't a supply chain team in country or contact in country, then yeah, it can be the team on the ground who can do that assessment. But it would always be good just to link in, it can just be a quick call to somebody just to say, this is what we've seen. What do you think? And then it can just be, as long as that's noted and it's saved on SharePoint that we've done this, this is what we've seen. If you could take, you know, if the team could take pictures of it as well. But you would always have a supply chain contact, even if it's back at HQ, who'd be working on the response, that could give you just some help and guidance on, like I said, checklists and things to look out for.
Thanks, Sash. Might be a good thing to practice on PDT. Never know.
Ah, there you go. Anything else? I think it's sort of good to know at this point as well is, you know, depending on the partner you can work with, some of our partners have really strong warehousing and really strong warehouse policies and procedures, but you also may be working with smaller partners or more inexperienced partners. And I think this is where we're a real sort of added value. So we can help our partners, so we can work with them on strengthening their policies or strengthening their procedures or sharing best practice with them as well, just to enable them to sort of, again, mature their policies and procedures when it comes around this. We can share tools with them around goods received notes, so that can help with their inventory management. And again, the sort of differing warehouses, you could have a commercial warehouse which is secure, or you could go to the other end of the spectrum where it could be a playground or a classroom, and it could be outside with a tarp over it. So it's really having that involvement to know what we're working with, where we can add value, and where we can best assist within that process as well. Any more on that before we move on? No, so going on to this, Yorick, I suppose this is a good one then. So warehouse selection. So a question now again is, so what should we be looking at, or what should our partners be looking at when you're assessing a warehouse? What type of things do you need to be taken into consideration?
The security of the location.
Yeah, great one. Any more for any more?
Size, kind of entry for vehicles, and moisture or general dryness.
Yeah, perfect. So, you know, is it weatherproof? Does it even have a roof? Is it structurally sound? You know, we've mentioned safety and security of it is a real key as well. Access into it, what is the access like? Is there access roads nearby? Physical access as well into the building. Unload, offload, do they have equipment? How safe is that? So there's a lot of different things that we would look into when assessing. Anything else? I think we've covered quite a lot there anyway. So moving on, so this is the tracking. So once the warehouse has been selected, oh no, just back one.
Oh, sorry. I heard the moving on. Too quick.
No, it's point 2 now of this slide. So yeah, this is looking how we track stock and inventory. So I just wanted to go through a few of the ways that we would keep track and manage the inventory. So we have something called Mendex, or the Logs app, that we utilize as a team. And this is really our internal platform that we use to track all of the orders, and we actually track movement as well, from point of order right through to point of delivery and then point of distribution. And also it's an information source for us for on stock levels, stock information. We hold product information, product specification on there as well. And then the goods received note. So it is a requirement from our partner to supply a goods received note. And that's for each separate consignment that's received or delivered into the warehouse. And it's recorded by our partner, but it's also recorded by us. And it's not only like a document that acknowledges delivery of goods to our partner, but what it allows us to do as well is manage any issues with damaged or missing stock immediately, so we can start that investigation, or we can start that piece of, are we going to replace anything, or where's been the issue? So that would really initiate that piece of work. And then the last one on tracking and managing stock is distribution reporting. So it's a requirement of all of our programs that distribution and reporting is managed, and it's supplied on a regular agreed basis. And that really allows us to sort of keep track of any movement of stock as well. Any questions on that? And then you can move on.
Thank you.
Thank you. So last mile trucking. So this is, we're looking at, so the orders have been placed. We've now got aid in country. It's warehouse, and this is when we're working with our partners to look at that last mile logistics or last mile trucking. And it's really what considerations need to be considered in an emergency. And this again is a question out to everybody. So what things do you think we need to be thinking about and considering when we're talking around sort of trucking, especially in an emergency?
Insurance.
Yeah, definitely.
You need to think about the route, like are areas affected by like flooding or the road conditions if there's been an earthquake, things like that.
Yeah, definitely. Access is a huge one.
Yeah, route optimization and I guess vehicle selection even, perhaps.
Yeah. Yep.
Fuel availability.
Yeah, that is a huge one as well. Especially when there's huge demand after. Go on, sorry, Michael.
I was just going to say, I guess the challenge for you is that once it gets to the last mile in remote areas, you're dealing with a small pool of potential trucking companies, and therefore, you know, being able to do robust due diligence on them will become challenging. You know, you want to make sure they don't just drive off with your aid, and you often probably don't have much choice.
Yeah.
Mm.
That's a good point. I
Yeah,
was about to say that, Sanch. How does that work when there's only one company that can do the trucking? How do you procure that when there's one company?
I suppose that's part of the scoping, and it's part of the work with your partners as well. So it would be linking into your coordination mechanisms. So you would work with partners, your logistics cluster, other organisations to see, you know, who they're utilising. Are there any other options that are out there? Has there been any issues? If there is just one supplier, then it's, are there any other means to get it there, or does it have to be used there? So yeah, it is a tricky one. I don't know if you've got anything more on that, Rachel.
Only just to say that I don't know whether I've come across a case where there's only been one provider. I've definitely had cases where trucks have been, availability have been few and far between. But sometimes in the other sense, we have the opposite problem whereby trucking companies will sort of inflate their prices because they know that there's a big demand. And in that case, that's where coordination through the logistics cluster is really key. Sometimes the logistics cluster will sort of secure trucking early on in a disaster at a set rate, and then offer that out to partners at a fixed rate. So then, you know, by going through that more sort of pre-vetted channel, you know that you're not inadvertently inflating the prices by sort of going to suppliers directly. There are things that you can do to sort of try and overcome some of the challenges.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was going to say it's more that the consideration is where you have a number of different trucking options and the price is inflated. Any more considerations?
Security.
Yeah, you have lined me up nicely for an example. Yeah, so security is a huge one, and I think just one that I wanted to mention, which I suppose highlights the complexity of you know, the areas that we operate in, is when we were on the Haiti response and we were working with a partner who was working in Haiti. We were working remote, and it was the last mile logistics from getting items from staging warehouse down to event. There was only one road, and the road that they had to pass was controlled by bandits. and they had to regularly suspend on a daily basis the trucks because there was looting and there was violent hijacking as well. So again, I just wanted to sort of highlight that example because they're real life examples of considerations that you need to take. And again, with limited access, limited routes, so then it's looking at, is there any other availability? I know that helicopters was one option that was looked at in that instance that couldn't be done, but yeah, the road and the route security is a huge one as well that you would need to consider. Anything more before we move on to the next one? No? Next one, please. Perfect, thank you. So this is what we just wanted to show you really, I suppose the comprehensive and the big list of people who we can actually coordinate with. So it's a broad network of actors that we share information with, and we do this for a number of reasons. You know, it's really good to have a coordinated approach. It's sharing information, it's sharing knowledge. You know, as you can see, the Impact Working Group, which I went into a little bit before, is a great source of information. You know, Airlink shares flight opportunities. It reduces as well the duplication of effort. And it also allows us to really create a streamlined supply chain by tapping on into all of these different sources of information and building like a network where you can share issues, share problems, and sort of share bottlenecks. And that was it 2 minutes before. So that's really open to questions on anything that both Rachel and I have discussed, or if there's anything else that you would like to ask us. We've got a bit of time and we can open it up for discussion.
If there is anything that comes later, you know where Sancha and I are, we're always happy to sort of jump on a call and have a chat, and I'm sure we'll sort of be crossing over much more frequently in programmes and emergency work anyway.
Can I just say thank you to Rachel and Sancha? A brilliant presentation. Thank you very much for giving up your time. I'm sure some or all of that maybe practicing in a few weeks' time. Hint, hint, warehouse. There they go. Shouldn't give this too much away. But no, thank you very much. And if there are any questions, either myself, Sancha or Rachel, I'm sure we'll be more than happy to answer them. Sorry. Okay.
Thank you for having us, and thanks everybody.
Thanks for having us.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Cheers.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you both.
Bye.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, guys. Great.